Spring 2002. Sherman County, Nebraska. 11 straight days of wind with gusts over 60 miles per hour. The kind of wind that strips fields down to bedrock. When it was over, the county had lost 2 inches of topsoil across thousands of acres. 120 tons per acre just gone. Farmers were looking at $25,000 per farm just to rebuild the soil. Then there was Miriam Dankert, 69 years old with 640 acres. Her farm lost nothing. 0 topsoil loss. The difference? 4 rows of trees her father had planted in 1938 as part of President Franklin D. Roosevelt's Dust Bowl recovery program. The United States Department of Agriculture had told her to cut them down. She said no. Her father had told her one thing: cut these trees and all you have to do is wait for the next Dust Bowl. The wind came to Sherman County, Nebraska in the spring of 2002, the way it always comes to the Great Plains, not as a visitor but as a permanent resident, a force so constant that farmers measure it not by whether it blows but by how hard. In the spring of 2002 it blew harder than usual. Between March and May, the county recorded 27 days, with sustained winds above 35 miles per hour, and peak gusts exceeding 55 miles per hour. This was not unusual enough to make national news. It was not unusual enough to be declared a disaster, but it was unusual enough to strip 2 inches of topsoil from thousands of acres of unprotected farmland, carrying it east in dark clouds that turned the midday sky the color of rust. The topsoil loss was concentrated on farms that had removed their shelterbelts, the rows of trees planted perpendicular to the prevailing wind, spaced and arranged to slow the wind and anchor the soil. Most of these shelterbelts had been planted in the 1930s and 1940s as part of the Great Plains Shelterbelt Project, a massive federal initiative to prevent another Dust Bowl by planting a great wall of trees from Canada to Texas. By 2002, many of those original shelterbelts were still standing, 70 years old, mature and effective, but many had been removed. The removals had accelerated through the 1990s as commodity prices fell and farmers looked for ways to increase acreage. A 4-row shelterbelt running along a quarter-mile field edge consumed approximately 1 acre of land. If corn was selling for $2.50 per bushel and yields averaged 140 bushels per acre, that acre of trees represented $350 in foregone annual revenue. Over 10 years, that is $3,500. Over 20 years, that is $7,000. The economics were straightforward, and agricultural extension agents, agronomists, and government advisors increasingly recommended shelterbelt removal as part of farm modernization. The trees, they argued, were a relic of 1930s conservation thinking, appropriate for the Dust Bowl era but unnecessary in an age of modern soil management, precision agriculture, and center pivot irrigation. By the spring of 2002, an estimated 40% of the original Great Plains Shelterbelt trees planted in Sherman County between 1935 and 1950 had been removed. Miriam Dankert, 69 years old that spring, had not removed a single tree. Her 640-acre farm still carried the same shelterbelts her father Otto had planted in 1938. When Miriam was 5 years old and the memory of Black Sunday, April 14, 1935, the day the sky turned black at midday from blowing dust, was still fresh enough that every farmer in the county understood what windbreaks were for. Otto Dankert had planted 4 shelterbelts on the property, each running east to west, perpendicular to the prevailing south wind, spaced approximately 1,200 feet apart. Each shelterbelt consisted of 4 rows, an outer row of native shrubs like wild plum and chokecherry, 2 central rows of fast-growing hardwoods like cottonwood and green ash, and an inner row of evergreens like ponderosa pine and eastern red cedar. The design was not Otto's invention. It was the standard government shelterbelt configuration, developed through wind tunnel testing and field trials in the 1930s to maximize wind reduction while minimizing water competition with adjacent crops. The Shelterbelts had been standing for 64 years by the spring of 2002. The cottonwoods and ash trees were 50 to 60 feet tall. The pines and cedars were 30 to 40 feet. The shrub rows were dense and healthy. The total acreage consumed by the 4 Shelterbelts was approximately 4 acres, less than 1% of the farm's total area. In March 2002, Tom Weiss, a 44-year-old agricultural specialist with the Natural Resources Conservation Service, visited the Dankert farm as part of a county-wide survey on irrigation efficiency and crop acreage optimization. Tom had been working in Sherman County since 1998, and one of his primary responsibilities was helping farmers transition to center pivot irrigation systems and maximize productive acreage. He had identified the Dankert property as a candidate for modernization, and when he drove out to the farm on a cold Thursday morning in mid-March, he came prepared with aerial photographs, soil maps, and a detailed proposal. Miriam met him at the farmhouse, a modest 2-story structure built in 1926, surrounded on 3 sides by the Shelterbelts her father had planted 70 years earlier. They sat at the kitchen table, and Tom spread out the aerial photos. "Mrs. Dankert," Tom began, "I have been looking at your property, and I think there is an opportunity here to increase your productive acreage and improve your irrigation efficiency. If you were to remove the Shelterbelts and install a modern center pivot system covering the full quarter section, you could bring an additional 4 acres into production. At current corn prices and average yields, that is about $1,400 in additional revenue per year. Over 10 years, that is $14,000. And the center pivot system would deliver water more efficiently than your current flood irrigation, which would reduce your pumping costs and improve yields on the existing acreage." Miriam listened without interrupting. She had heard versions of this pitch before, not from Tom specifically, but from neighbors, from seed dealers, and from agricultural magazines. The logic was consistent. Trees take up space, space is money, and modern technology makes the trees obsolete. When Tom finished, Miriam asked a single question. "Have you read the government reports from the Shelterbelt project?" Tom admitted he had not. He knew the broad history: Franklin D. Roosevelt, the Dust Bowl, trees planted to stop wind erosion. But he had not read the original technical documentation. Miriam rose from the table, walked to a bookshelf in the next room, and returned carrying a bound volume published in 1942 by the Forest Service, titled Shelterbelts and Microclimate, Technical Bulletin No. 441. The book was water-stained and dog-eared but intact. It had belonged to Otto Dankert, and he had annotated it extensively in pencil. "My father read this when it came out," Miriam said, opening the book to a page marked with a slip of paper, "and this is what it says about wind reduction." She read aloud. "A properly designed Shelterbelt of moderate density can reduce wind velocity by 60 to 80% for a distance downwind equal to 10 times the height of the trees. For a Shelterbelt 50 feet tall, effective wind protection extends 500 feet downwind. This wind reduction decreases soil erosion by wind by 70 to 90% within the protected zone." Tom nodded. "That was important in the 1930s, he said, but we do not have dust bowl conditions anymore. We have soil conservation practices, crop residue management, and irrigation. The risk of wind erosion today is much lower than it was 70 years ago." Miriam closed the book and set it on the table between them. "My father told me something when I was a girl," she said. "He told me that President Roosevelt planted these trees to save the Great Plains after the Dust Bowl. And he said, if you ever cut them down, all you have to do is wait for the next Dust Bowl and it will come. He was right in 1938, and he is right now." Tom thanked Miriam for her time, left a copy of his proposal, and drove back to town. He noted in his report that the Dankert property was not a viable candidate for modernization due to landowner resistance to Shelterbelt removal. 6 weeks later, the wind proved Otto Dankert correct. The wind event of April 2002 was not a single storm, but a sustained period of high winds that lasted 11 days, from April 18th through April 28th. Peak gusts during this period reached 62 miles per hour on April 22nd, recorded at the Loop City Weather Station 15 miles southeast of the Dankert farm. The wind was dry. Relative humidity dropped below 20% on 7 of the 11 days, and the soil was bare, freshly tilled and planted but not yet covered by growing crops. On farms that had removed their Shelterbelts, the topsoil began to move almost immediately. The wind lifted particles from the exposed fields and carried them downwind in visible plumes. On the worst days, April 21st through April 24th, the air was thick with suspended dust. Visibility dropped to less than a quarter mile, and drivers on Highway 92 reported near whiteout conditions, even though there was no rain, no snow, only wind and soil. The Nebraska Conservation and Survey Division, based at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln, conducted a post-event assessment in May 2002. The assessment used aerial photography, ground surveys, and soil core samples to estimate topsoil loss across Sherman County. The findings were stark. Fields without Shelterbelts or other windbreaks lost an average of 1.8 inches of topsoil during the 11-day wind event. Fields with intact Shelterbelts lost an average of 0.2 inches. The difference represented approximately 120 tons of soil per acre, soil that contained organic matter, nutrients, and the biological structure necessary for productive agriculture. The Dankert farm lost no measurable topsoil. Tom Weiss returned to the Dankert property on May 3, 2002, not to deliver a proposal, but to understand what had happened. He had driven through the county over the previous 2 weeks, observing the damage. He had seen fields stripped down to hardpan, subsoil exposed in long wind-scoured furrows. He had seen fences half buried in drifted topsoil, ditches filled with 6 feet of deposited sediment. He had talked to farmers who were calculating whether it was economically viable to continue farming land that had lost 2 inches of its most fertile layer in 11 days. And then he had driven past the Dankert farm and seen fields that looked untouched. Miriam met him at the end of the driveway. Tom asked if he could walk the property, and she agreed. They walked for nearly an hour. Tom carried a soil probe and a GPS unit. Miriam brought a walking stick and the same patient expression she had worn in March. The difference was visible even to an untrained eye. On the Dankert farm, the soil surface was intact. Crop residue from the previous year was still in place. The newly planted corn seedlings were undisturbed. There were no drifts, no scour marks, and no exposed subsoil. The fields looked the way they should have looked in early May. Tilled, planted, and beginning to green up. Tom probed the soil in multiple locations. The topsoil layer was consistently 8 to 10 inches deep, consistent with previous measurements he had taken from county soil surveys. On adjacent properties that had removed their Shelterbelts, the topsoil was now 6 to 7 inches deep, and in some areas it was gone entirely. "How did you know this would happen?" Tom asked. "I did not know," Miriam said, "but my father did. He lived through Black Sunday in 1935. He told me he watched the sky turn black at noon, watched the topsoil blow away, and watched neighbors lose everything because there was nothing to stop the wind. That is why he planted these trees. Not for me, not for him, for the land. So it would still be here when I needed it." Tom walked to the edge of the nearest Shelterbelt and stood in the space between the tree rows and the adjacent cornfield. The wind was still blowing. It had been blowing all spring, and it would keep blowing through summer. But here, sheltered by the trees, the wind speed was noticeably lower. Tom pulled a wind meter from his field bag and took measurements at 3 locations. In the open field, 300 feet south of the Shelterbelt, it was 18 miles per hour. At the base of the Shelterbelt, it was 9 miles per hour. In the protected zone, 150 feet north of the Shelterbelt, it was 5 miles per hour. The Shelterbelt was reducing wind speed by approximately 70% within the protected zone, exactly as the 1942 government bulletin had predicted. And because wind erosion increases exponentially with wind speed, meaning a doubling of wind speed produces a 4 to 8-fold increase in erosion, the 70% reduction in wind speed translated to a greater than 90% reduction in soil loss. Tom took photographs. He took notes. He measured tree heights, row spacing, and the dimensions of the protected zones. He walked the full length of all 4 Shelterbelts, cataloging species, health, and structure. When he finished, he stood at the edge of the property looking south across the county, where he could see, even from 2 miles away, the brown scars of eroded fields. "Mrs. Dankert," he said, "would you be willing to let me bring other farmers here to show them what you have done?" Miriam smiled. "I have not done anything," she said. "My father did this 70 years ago. But yes, you can bring them. Maybe they will listen now." The first field tour of the Dankert Shelterbelts took place on June 14, 2002. Tom Weiss organized it through the Sherman County Farm Bureau, and 32 farmers attended. The tour lasted 3 hours. Tom walked the group through the property, explained the Shelterbelt design, showed the wind speed measurements, and presented side-by-side aerial photographs of the Dankert farm and adjacent properties before and after the April wind event. The difference was visible even from the air. The Dankert fields were dark with topsoil, while neighboring fields showed the pale brown of exposed subsoil. Miriam stood at the edge of the group and answered questions. Most of the questions were practical. How much water do the trees use? Do they compete with the crops? And how do you maintain them? Miriam's answers were straightforward. The trees use some water, but the water saved by reducing wind and evaporation offsets the tree's consumption. The competition zone extends about 50 feet from the tree rows, so you do not plant crops there. But the yield increase in the protected zone more than compensates. Maintenance is minimal. Simply remove dead trees, thin overcrowded sections every 10 to 15 years, and otherwise leave them alone. One farmer asked the question that Tom had asked. "How did you know the wind would come back?" "I did not know," Miriam said. "But my father told me that wind is the one thing that never leaves the Great Plains. It is always here. Some years it is quiet, and you forget about it. Other years it reminds you. The trees are here for the years when it reminds you." The second field tour took place in August 2002, this time organized by the University of Nebraska Extension Service. 47 people attended, including farmers, agronomists, and soil conservation specialists from 6 counties. The third tour in October drew 63 attendees, including representatives from the Natural Resources Conservation Service and the Nebraska Department of Agriculture. By November 2002, the Dankert farm had been visited by more than 150 people, and Tom Weiss had compiled a 20-page technical report documenting the Shelterbelt structure, the wind speed measurements, the soil loss comparisons, and the economic analysis. The economic analysis was particularly striking. While Miriam had foregone approximately $1,400 per year in crop revenue from the 4 acres occupied by Shelterbelts, she had avoided soil loss that would cost an estimated $18,000 to $25,000 to remediate through topsoil replacement or long-term soil building programs. Over the 70-year life of the Shelterbelts, the return on investment was greater than 12 to 1, even before accounting for the yield increases in the protected zones. Tom submitted his report to the Federal Conservation Office in December 2002, and in 2003, the agency reinstated the Shelterbelt component of the Conservation Reserve Program, which had been allowed to lapse in the 1990s. The reinstated program offered cost-share funding for Shelterbelt planting, maintenance, and restoration, and it explicitly cited the Sherman County wind event of April 2002 and the Dankert Farm case study as evidence of the continued need for tree-based wind erosion control. By 2005, 127 new Shelterbelts had been planted in Sherman County under the revived program. By 2010, more than 800 Shelterbelts had been planted or restored across the central Great Plains states. In 2008, the Forest Service published a retrospective study titled Lessons from the Great Plains Shelterbelt Project: Long-Term Efficacy and Economic Returns. The study analyzed wind erosion data, crop yield data, and economic returns from 75 farms across Nebraska, Kansas, South Dakota, and North Dakota that had retained their original 1930s-era Shelterbelts. The Dankert farm was featured prominently in the study as one of the best preserved and most comprehensively documented examples. The study's conclusions were unambiguous. Properly maintained, Shelterbelts reduced wind speed by 60 to 75% in the protected zone, reduced soil erosion by 70 to 95%, increased crop yields in the protected zone by 10 to 25% due to reduced wind stress, and improved moisture retention, and generated long-term economic returns that exceeded the opportunity cost of the land occupied by the trees by a factor of 8 to 12 over a 50-year period. The study also included a policy recommendation. Given the increasing frequency of severe wind events in the Great Plains, likely driven by long-term climate variability, and the continued vulnerability of agricultural soils to wind erosion, federal and state agencies should prioritize the restoration and expansion of Shelterbelt systems as a low-cost, low-maintenance, biologically sustainable soil conservation strategy. By 2010, Tom Weiss had left the federal agency and joined the University of Nebraska Extension Service as a Shelterbelt specialist. His job was to help farmers design, plant, and maintain windbreaks using the principles documented in the Dankert case study. Between 2010 and 2020, Tom worked with 214 farm operations to establish or restore Shelterbelts across Nebraska. By 2024, Miriam Dankert is 91 years old and no longer farms actively, but the land is still in the family, managed by her nephew Marcus. The 4 Shelterbelts planted by Otto Dankert in 1938 are now 86 years old and still standing, still functioning, and still protecting the soil. In the spring of 2024, another wind event, not as severe as April 2002, but significant, passed through Sherman County. Fields without windbreaks lost an average of 0.4 inches of topsoil. The Dankert farm lost none. Marcus Dankert, 53 years old, has never considered removing the Shelterbelts. He has added 2 new ones, planted in 2015, using native species and following the same design guidelines his great-grandfather used in 1938. The trees are growing. In another 20 years they will be mature. In another 50 years they will be what the original Shelterbelts are now, a living legacy planted once, maintained lightly, and effective for as long as the wind blows across the Great Plains, which is to say, forever.